Welcome back to BioInsights. If you're new to BioInsights, we talk about many topics from exercise science and how it impacts a commercial environment, which I like to call commercial reality. And today, I want to talk about engineering design. Yes, engineering design. Um, Suspension bridges, as an example, it's built once. Steel cables, hydraulic pistons, load-bearing beams, fixed entities that are engineered for a predetermined amount of stress. And the moment that a bridge opens to traffic, it begins to slow and irreversibly decay, rust, eventually
Sounds
fail.
like a human.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. So in machines, it constantly rebuilds. If we're machines really, and we're constantly rebuilding our own pistons, and we're thickening those suspension cables, and we're rewriting our own software, we do this simultaneously as we're driving down the highway. So from a biological structure, it responds precisely to measurable, dynamic, physical forces that we choose to apply to it, which means, here's the truth, both beautiful and terrifying sometimes. The physics that govern an Olympic sprinter that accelerates out of the blocks, it's the same physics for a person that's 85 years old and getting out of a chair. It's the same engine. It's the same brake pads. It's the same kinetic chain. So today's discussion, we're going to really talk about visible movement, and not like a squat or curl or jump. It's the invisible forces underneath that we're going to be talking about that can trigger maybe a fall or can trigger a problem. So we're going to challenge certain concepts, certain dogmas, open versus closed chain. We're going to talk about, we're going to challenge that full range motion gospel. We're going to talk about cross education. Again, it's a phenomenon that is so weird. It sounds like pseudoscience, but it's well documented. We're also going to talk about the brakes of that engine again. And we're going to land on some research. We're going to talk about some clinical numbers. We're going to talk about the kinetic chain across the lifespan. So returning back for my regular conversation, and there's no better person I'd like to talk to about this, is Dr. Juris. If you're new to the call, he's been an MBA consultant. He's been an educator. He's a PhD human movement biomechanist. He's the one that I've learned from over the years. And I welcome you back, PJ. I look forward to having this discussion with you.
Thanks, Marcelo. As usual, it's always great to be here talking to you about these things. And, when you say we're talking about things again and again, I don't think we can talk about them enough. So they can be introduced into any conversation from any point of view, and they always bring value to that conversation. So I think it's great. Thanks for having me. And, I can't wait to get into this.
Yeah, and I think, we talked about this, in the past about framing kinematics as kind of a movie playing on a screen, and the kinetics is the projector behind it. And we talked about internal muscle contractions, gravity, joint torque, joint friction, the neuromuscular signals that travel down the spinal cord specifically. But all of it is invisible to that camera, right? So our coaches and PTs essentially only training what they can see. I guess that's where I want to start.
That is a wonderful, wonderful question. And the answer is yes. I mean, essentially, unless you have the tools to measure things like force, you can't see force, right? We know what it is. And actually, let me retract that. Not everybody could even tell you what a force is. So, I stand in front of 100 trainers and ask them what's a force, and inevitably someone will raise a hand and say force is mass times acceleration. And my response to that is, I'm not asking you for the equation. I'm asking you to describe or define what a force is. And very few people can do it once they have to leave the equation out of the conversation. Very simply, a force is a push or a pull with the intention of accelerating an object. That's what a force is. But you can see the push and pull. Those are the kinematics, right? The kinematics define the motion, right? The displacement, velocity, acceleration. Those are kinematics. Force is kinetics. And unless you have a force transducer or a force platform, you can't see it and you have no other way of measuring it. But it's critical to understand what force is and how it applies.
Yeah, I think the best way to kind of another analogy would be a golfer, right? An amateur golf swing, you know, like me, I grunt, and I'm swinging, and it's not as effortless. So that's not really a strength difference, right? Compared to a pro, it's a kinetic chain difference, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a sequential application of segments, right? Segmental velocity. The force that you generate is coming out of the ground, right? So you have to apply force into the ground in order to start that motion. Try doing it just being, hovering in space and not already in motion. That's going to be hard to do. So you got to apply force somewhere to get it going. There are a lot of other elements, obviously, to hit a successful golf ball. Um, but sometimes you can put the most ugly sequence of movements together, and for some reason the ball ends up going 300 yards down the middle of the fairway. And you ask yourself, how I do that? How did I do that? And the answer is, I have no idea, and I'm not going to be able to repeat it. So accidents happen, but I think where the force part comes into play, especially in motion, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is we look at certain movements and we prescribe movements in a way that's based on what we see and not necessarily what we understand about how the forces are acting on that system. And that's a critical distinction.
Let's bring in the work energy principle, what's taught in, high school physics classes, basically. I just had to review it with my daughter. Um,
Hmm.
Work equals change in kinetic energy, right? And I think the example that the class talked about was the wooden block on a ramp. It's clean, simple. How do we apply it to human beings? And is it I mean, it's infinitely more complicated. Why?
Well, work is force times distance, right? So it's the force that you create multiplied by the distance over which you're producing it. So technically, you can generate a lot of force, but if there's no movement occurring, then you're not technically doing any work. Energy is something different. Energy is, how much heat is basically generated in order to produce some of these actions. And so you can generate a lot of energy and not do any work. So an example of that in a weightlifting environment, for example, would be doing an isometric contraction, right? So you could generate a lot of energy through your muscles and contract those muscles, and that requires energy in order to do it. But if you're isometric, you're not moving anything anywhere, and therefore you're not doing any work. So it's hard to sometimes break those apart, because just because you're doing no work doesn't mean you're not doing anything. But we should be able to quantify different aspects of what we're doing so that we can accurately track what people are doing, how well they're doing, how they're progressing, and how we want to engage with them.
Okay, I think the one piece I want to review before we get into the open and closed chain discussion is
Okay.
this kind of encapsulates everything, really. We've talked about leakage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why understanding force and why understanding efficiency, because that's basically what we just started off the discussion with, the
Mm-hmm.
difference between a novel golfer and a pro golfer. Um, Leakage is a term that I've heard it described that way, where there is, and the other way of looking at this is the joint by joint theory, and identifying proper movement where it all of a sudden is not, it is creating either extra movement or it's not mechanically efficient in use of range of motion for that joint, or there is a deviation where it's causing, let's say a good example would be, uh, an individual just only does bilateral work. And what it does is that it will create joint limitations. And this is an example. I've seen squatters like myself who, it's taken a long time for me to be able to push off on my big toe because I've back squatted heavy for so long that for a long period of time as a power lifter, I forgot that unilateral work was essential. And I only learned that through the hard way. Can you kind of describe that concept or that framework of from efficiency to inefficiency in kind of, we can hopefully put that to rest. I doubt it, but I imagine we'll talk about it again.
Sure, we'll talk about it forever. So, e- so let's look at sort of an energy work force output type of situation. A lot of people are often trained or taught or coached to contract muscles, right? And we may get into EMG here again, but sometimes we look at, well, the greater the EMG activity, the better. And there are a lot of things that drive EMG activity up. Now, there's no correlation between EMG and force output, and there's no correlation between EMG and strength. All it's doing is it's telling you how much energy is going into basically a muscle. How much is the nervous system driving a muscle in order for it to contract? Now, where am I going with this? Let's say we're doing a squat and we have a lot of co-contraction going on around a joint when we want that joint to be moving smoothly, but instead you got all these muscles that are co-contracting around that joint and it's actually stiffening the joint. So we would do that if we were squatting on a Bosu. And we'll get into this if you want, but when you're squatting on a Bosu, what's happening is you have this unstable surface, which is causing all of these muscles around the joints to contract at the same time because the system is trying to manage the instability. So you have these joints that should be moving smoothly, but instead you've got so many muscles contracting around the joints in order to stiffen them to make you more stable. So that's increasing your energy output because you have all those muscles working, but the fact that you have all that co-contraction is actually reducing your force output. So it works against itself. So you have a high level of energy expenditure with very little force production and even worse work being accomplished as a result of it. So we tend to get hung up on some of these things like unstable surfaces or EMG activity. Let's just make the muscles contract as much as possible. It's not always effective if muscles are working against each other when you don't want them to be.
I think that's great. I think that kind of talks about, you know, again, efficiency and inefficiency and choosing the right uh, practice, more or less. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that practice lends to the discussion that we're going to jump in here with open chain versus closed chain. There's certain frameworks that talk about this. They say squats are closed because the foot is fixed. Leg extensions are open because the foot moves freely. And the reason that it's treated as gospel is that closed chain are the argument is the compression, the ground reaction forces that travel back through the bone structure, the mechano receptor stimulation, and then the force co-contractions, the force co-contractions like you talked about there, all are really important, but binary in itself. So does it hold up to scrutiny?
Well, not in my mind. I mean, I think the whole nature of open and closed chain is misunderstood. And look, you're right, this is gospel. I mean, this is stuff that's been talked about for decades and decades. And, I want to cite a particular paper too, that because I worked in orthopedic rehabilitation and there was gospel around that as well. Um, I think, first of all, is the misinterpretation of what open and closed chain means. Closed chain means that both ends of the linkage model are fixed. That's a closed chain, right? I mean, when you have a linkage model and both ends are fixed and they can't move, that is the definition of a closed chain. In an open chain, only one end of the linkage model is fixed and the other end is free to move, which, by the way, makes a squat an open chain exercise, not a
Yeah.
closed chain exercise. So a push-up on the floor is a closed chain because your hands and feet are both fixed. Now, what does that mean? I mean, everybody is focused on force transmission. By the way, if I do what people traditionally call an open chain exercise, a leg extension, right, which it is, but when I generate force doing a leg extension, there's a reactive component to that. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So whether I'm doing a squat or a leg extension, I'm still getting reactive components generated.
Yep.
And those reactive components are what are creating the forces across the joints. So, this whole notion that you have to be standing on the floor in order to generate forces through the system is just incorrect.
I think the definition starts to feel arbitrary, like an example, a sled push. Your hands are fixed, right? But your feet are moving. So is the upper body a closed chain and then the lower body an open, or swimming? So, it becomes, what is it then?
Swimming
Yeah.
is open chain.
Yeah.
Um, so a sled push, when you think about it, once the sled's in motion, then your hands are in motion. So it's an open chain. Here's the thing to understand about it. It's not necessarily a force production generation vector issue. Open and closed chain is really about available degrees of freedom. That's what open and closed chain is about. Because what happens is when you have a closed chain, let's say you're doing a push-up, your feet are fixed, your hands are fixed. If you change the position of one of those segments in that chain, all of the other positions are predetermined. All right, this is degrees of freedom. So if you fix a certain portion of your body and you want to move in a certain way, you have no more freedom to change the way that movement occurs. But when only one end of the system is fixed, your entire body has all the degrees of freedom available to move any way it wants to move. So I was having a conversation with a devotee of one certain person who ran a particular institute. I'm not going to go any further than that. who claimed that if you have a change in position at your foot, it's going to affect your left foot, it's going to affect what's going on in your right shoulder because it's a closed chain. And I said, that's absolutely ridiculous. There are so many degrees of freedom between your left foot and your right shoulder that any kind of accommodation can occur anywhere in that system so that it may have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with your shoulder. So
And
that's what we need to think about. It's not like, how is the force going through this system? It's, how am I organizing the motion based on degrees of freedom and the available movement that I have? That's what it's about.
yeah, I think I keep coming back, and I think I've heard this from you, which was whip versus hydraulic press framing. And you talked about it, I think, as the example of leg extension being a high velocity, but a lot of shear forces, right? And then the squat is the compressive to force to stabilize. You know, w- is there? It's basically the force travels differently through the body. Um, if
Yeah,
you, how
but
would you
but you're
classify?
still creating joint torques no matter how you do it. So I think just to, I didn't mean to cut you
Yeah,
off,
no,
but
no, no. Go ahead.
the better way to look at this, especially when you're looking at ground reaction forces, is really to look at it from is it terminally fixed or is it not terminally fixed? Terminally fixed means you're standing on your feet. Not terminally fixed means you're not, you're sitting down, or your force is being applied at a tangent to the radius, right? That's what people typically think of as open chain. But it's are you terminally fixed or non-terminally fixed? And then that's how you apply force. So if you're standing, you're going to apply force down into the ground. So there's that push. You're pushing, right? A whip is when you have multi-segmental motion and one joint is moving in one way and the other joint is moving in the opposite way. So if you have shoulder flexion and elbow extension, that's a whip. Okay. If you have both joints moving in the same way, that's a reach. So those are just different types of movements that we can categorize, but it also requires different forces acting on the joints in order to produce them.
I think an elite example would be a baseball pitcher.
Yeah.
That's yeah, I think that's a good example of how we could like the nuance of how force travels, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
an example of an efficient individual compared to Joe Bag of Donuts on the weekend who struggles to throw a fastball compared to the major leaguer that does it really well. So he understands how to bring those whips and reaches and the compressive forces and move the center of mass along with the key thing in that movement would be dissociation between the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle, so they could actually know how to maximize the force that they're generating.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that gets to the notion of skill. Do you know how to do that?
and,
Um,
and that takes time, right? That takes reps, that takes practice. And I think that's the one thing that people need to get in that mindset when it comes to exercise. It's practice. So it's,
yeah, I mentioned also there's a study, and I want people to really try to wrap their heads around this. There was a study that came out in like 1993. I think it was published by a guy named Greg Lutz. And this was, so they were looking at ACL tension, right? Shear forces in the knee, and particularly the effect on the ACL. And this created a whole generation of dogma. And this is when we were talking about this earlier. So what he did was he measured people doing a squat versus a leg extension, and the measurement was how much shear was applied to the ACL. All right. They also looked at the PCL, but we're focused mostly on the ACL. And what they
yeah,
concluded was that open chain exercises, the way they define it, or leg extension, generated more shear at the ACL than the squat. Therefore,
they're
never do leg
evil.
extensions. It's evil. So for decades, like, people ran with that and said, don't do leg extensions
It's not
because
functional.
it's too much shear force at the knee. Well, just for the record, I have never seen anyone tear an ACL on a leg extension. Just saying. I mean, in all my years, that's never happened. But here's the thing. This is what we really need to understand. What he discovered was that with the closed chain, with the squat, the shear stress on the ACL was negligible, right? It was hardly measurable. Whereas in the leg extension, it was 400 newtons.
Hmm.
Okay. So you say, wow, I mean, that's huge. But here's the thing that he didn't say in his study. The tensile capacity of the ACL, in other words, how much force it can tolerate before it snaps, is 2,400 newtons.
Wow.
So when you're applying 400 newtons against the structure this gets back to your bridge, right?
Yeah.
When the bridge can tolerate 2,400 newtons and your load is 400 newtons, Who cares? Like, it's not a problem. So the analogy, that I have for that study is you have a thimble of water and you have a cup of water. Well, yeah, the cup of water has a lot more water than the thimble, but you're not going to drown in a cup of water. So even though the leg extension generates more shear force than the squat, it's not even close to enough to do any harm to the ACL. So who cares? And that's what people lost sight of. They lost sight of, what does this mean in real life? And, I took like 30 years before the British Journal of Sports Medicine came out with a position paper saying it's okay to do leg extensions.
Yeah, and I still hear the argument though, oh, it's not functional, or you have to do barbell lifts or dumbbell lifts, and that's more meaningful. And I think people just it's work. We have to understand you need to get the person to do work, whatever gets them to do work consistently over a period of time, and that could be any resistance tool. And that's what people need to stop falling prey to schools of thought or dogma. A good example is the forward lunge versus the backwards lunge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same, they look identical, same muscles are working, but mechanically it's completely different. Can you explain that? Because I know you're big on lunges.
Yeah, I really like doing lunges. Well, there's things that need to be clarified, in this conversation. When we're talking about a forward lunge, are we really talking about stepping forward with anterior acceleration, right? Anterior and downward acceleration. Is that the forward lunge, or is it what I see people claiming to be a forward lunge, which is nothing more than a
lateral.
split squat, or just, vertical displacement of the center of mass, over a staggered foot position? That's a split squat. That's not a forward lunge. So then the backward lunge is really interesting, because the question is, are you really lunging onto your back foot? Because now you're moving your center of mass backwards and down onto your back foot. Or again, are you just stepping back with your back foot and lowering yourself toward the floor, which is really a step back. It's a step back split squat. It's really all that is again. So it's just a split squat. So it really depends on how you're defining the movement and what the goal is. If you want to do a backward lunge, first of all, I cringe when I watch people doing it, because they're overloading their Achilles on their back leg, right? I mean, and by the way, now we're talking about compressive loading and knee loading, knee joint loading. When you step onto your back leg, your rear knee, your trail knee is getting huge loads imparted on it.
Yeah.
So it's not healthy for the back leg to lunge onto your back foot, and it's also putting a lot of stress on your Achilles. Now, there may be reasons to do it. I don't suggest never doing anything, but you have to have an appropriate reason for doing that. Otherwise, just do a split squat.
I agree. The difference I think that you talked about was the center of mass
Mm-hmm.
in the vertical ground reactions, and a forward lunge. Really, there's VMO firing for patella tracking purposes. The backwards lunge kind of eliminates that horizontal momentum, but the muscular stimulus is the same, but the deceleration costs are different. I think that's why people tend to do a backwards lunge more than a forward lunge, but no one understands that there is stress not only in a foot, but that Achilles structure that most people they don't even realize it until the client actually brings it up or they feel it.
Yeah, I mean, you're putting a lot of stress on the Achilles tendon. My colleague Corey Hoffman and I did a research study when we were at Cybex. We actually got this published, and we were looking at, and this gets to the lunging, like where is your knee over your foot or ankle when you're doing a lunge? Like everyone will tell you the right way to do a lunge is what we call the 90-90 position. So your back's up straight and your knees over your ankle, so you're in it like looking like a chair. And so what we did was we looked at patellofemoral compressive loads when you're in 3 different positions, when you allow your whole body to go forward. So your knees forward of your toe and your trunk is forward. We looked at your knee forward of your toe and your trunk upright, and then we looked at the 90-90. And what's interesting is in the 90-90, when you do your lunge, the patellofemoral compressive load on your back knee is almost 3 times greater than it is on your front knee when you let it go in front of your toe. So I don't know why people insist on doing it that way, but you are trashing your back knee,
It,
thinking that somehow you're protecting your forward knee. That doesn't make any sense to me.
it's easier to teach, I think, for a lot of people. Step back, because the step forward for them, that force absorption part is, it's the acceleration part is I think for me it was always an assessment indicator too. If they can't slow themselves down, we know exactly that what we need to be working with them. That every movement is an assessment, period. But
Well, that's true.
I think most people forget, and I kind of like that really brings me to the next topic that I want, the next dogma I want to challenge. The fitness world really talks about full range of motion as the gold standard. Always, really the topic of what's the difference between partial reps and full range reps? And can you tell us what's happening on that sarcomere level of the muscle? Kind of why we need to really understand this topic?
Well, on a sarcomere level, it's just a question of how much cross-bridge attachment and shortening is occurring at the muscle level. So, I mean, that's sort of at a micro level. I think the question itself is really interesting. And by the way, I was in the gym yesterday watching people work out, and I can tell you that almost no one that I was watching was working through a full range of motion on any exercise that they were doing. So, but the question is, does it matter?
Yeah.
And that's really the issue at hand. And I think when we talk about things like dogma and we talk about rules that we have to follow, you have to ask why. Like, why does it really matter? And this also gets to, like, is a leg extension functional? It all kind of wraps up in the same sort of concept. And the concept is your brain smart enough to figure out what to do when you're training, right? Or is the brain so devolved that if you work a muscle in isolation, it won't know what to do with it? I mean, it's kind of ridiculous when you put it on that level. So the truth is, whether you're in full range of motion or partial range of motion, it really doesn't matter unless you're working isometrically. And there's the only thing that you really need to think about. If you're working isometrically, the strength that you gain is typically
Joint specific.
related to the joint position at which you're doing it.
Yeah.
So if you're training isometrically at 90 degrees of elbow flexion, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've improved your strength at 10 degrees of elbow flexion. And so when you're working isometrically, you need to make sure you work at a variety of joint angles. Short of that, I don't think it matters very much. And by the way, I do leg extensions because, I have an arthritic knee and it's a great thing to strengthen the quads for my knee. I only do from 0, which is full extension, to 20 degrees of flexion because I'm trying to minimize patellofemoral compression, which irritates my arthritis. So working in that range is actually highly prescribed for me. So for someone to come along and say, well, you should be working through a full range, I tell them to take a hike.
There's also it doesn't just strengthen you within that range of motion. There's a carryover, right?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit, but not to extreme
Yeah,
ranges.
not
But
to extreme ranges, but it doesn't just say you're only getting stronger. That's the misnomer too, that you're only getting strong within 0 to 20 degrees. No, there is a larger range than that.
well, and by the way, that carries over to movements too, right? So when people think of functional, they think you have to move within the specific movement path of any activity for it to be functional. And that's kind of a weird thought, because it suggests, look, if I'm going to pick up a coffee cup, there are infinite number of ways that I can configure my arm with all the degrees of freedom to get that cup. Does that mean I need an infinite number of strength training patterns to be able to do that? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
And Mark Latache came up with a concept that he called the uncontrolled manifold. And what it means in English is that when we're moving in a certain path, we actually have the ability to apply force at a whole range around that path, not just specifically that path. That we have the capability of generating appropriate controlled forces in just about any direction except what they called an orthogonal direction, which is basically at a 90-degree angle to that path. So yeah, we get too hung up on movement specificity and function. And, the brain can figure it out, honestly. We're pretty smart.
Now let's flip this topic. Let's talk about momentum.
Okay.
Does it hide weakness in the middle of a lift? Because of the bar path, right? Or the bar moves through a mid-range, let's say, not because the muscle is strong at that angle. Let's say it's because of the joint angle that we're taking advantage of. Is that person being neurologically lazy? Have they ever, does momentum carries that load. There's a reason for that, to move that inertia, right? So is momentum cheating?
Mm. Um, it depends, I guess, on the specific exercise and what your goal is, what you're trying to accomplish. But
Yes.
uh, generally speaking, the way I look at it is, if you apply enough force to a weight so that it takes on a life of its own, which is kind of what we talk about with momentum. If you can apply enough force to a weight to accelerate it to the point that it's moving without any force, right? It's just going now. As soon as you stop applying force, it starts to decelerate instantly. As soon as you stop the force application, it immediately starts decelerating. But it has inertia, it has momentum. But if you're able to do that, then you're applying a huge amount of force to it. So that's not being lazy, that's being effective.
So let's use an example, a power lifter using a floor press or a board press, where it's a dead stop at that sticking point. They're basically recruiting more motor units at that exact angle, right? So where they're the weakest. Can you walk us through that logic?
Well, the sticking point issue is a little bit different. So if we're moving at sort of a constant velocity through a range of motion, there will be a point during that range when the leverage that we have available through our mechanical system is overtaken by the leverage against which you are working, and we stick, right? So that the mechanical loading that we're dealing with at that point, at that range of motion, is greater than our ability to compensate for it, and we get this stick. Now, we can try to move through that sticking point to what we were just saying. If we apply enough force early on, when we have the leverage advantage, we can push through that sticking point and then get it so that we're able to continue. Whether you call that cheating or just being smart, I'll leave that up to you.
I think the kind of bring it all together. I think intent dictates the outcome.
Of
You know,
course.
and I
Yeah.
think that's what really matters. I think people want to label again. The dogma says that's bad. I think we need to push back and understand what it is before before we just basically don't critically think about it. And I think that's the problem. Um, I want to now kind of talk about muscle action.
Hmm.
And I think that's a term that we need to be labeling contractions, right? Because that's really what it is. Um, let's look at concentric, eccentric, isometric. I love using the analogy of concentric being the gas pedal, eccentric being your brakes, and then isometric being the or the parking of the brake. Can you walk us through an example of a movement to kind of frame that first?
So first is to define those types of contraction. Concentric means the muscle's developing tension while it's shortening. Eccentric means it's developing tension while it's being lengthened. Notice I didn't say while lengthening because the muscle can't actively lengthen, so
Yep.
it has to be lengthened. And isometric means it's developing tension without any change in length at all. So those are the conditions. Typically speaking, concentric is you apply a concentric load when you're trying to, I mean, I can't even say when you're trying to accelerate it in a certain direction, because with some things, gravity's doing the accelerating. I think it's, you're not getting any concentric contraction there at all. It's all eccentric. Yeah, so we can, to really simplify it, you're applying the gas concentrically, you're applying the brakes eccentrically, and isometrically is you're just trying to stop everything,
Keep it in
right?
park. That's how I was telling.
I think that's a very fair way of looking at it, to make a simple analogy. Yes.
And eccentrically, you're typically 20 to 40% stronger than concentrically.
Yeah,
But
because it's more of a mechanical decoupling or uncoupling of those cross bridges than is in concentric. It's an active process. You need energy to uncouple the cross bridges. In eccentric contractions, you don't. So it's energy efficient.
and I think our industry is obsessed with concentric movement. But once you upgrade and I used this term before, once you upgrade the motor with an 800 horsepowered engine, what happens to the car when you decide to approach that turn and the chassis is not strong enough?
Or the brakes aren't good enough.
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think
so
that,
when you don't have the brakes, the nervous system says, we're not
yeah.
going to let you go that fast.
And I think that's where I think we need to kind of talk about, and we've talked about this, eccentric loading, attenuated eccentric loading, heavier on the way down or than on the way up. Historically, it's been done with weight releasers. You can do it with um, bands. You can do it with now digital strength training tools.
Hmm.
I think for the listener, those techniques, you know, um, let's say, can you do that on machines like a leg extension or a leg curl? And what's the adaptation to that?
Interestingly, like when you mentioned leg extensions, so here's the way that I think it would be useful for people to think about it. Let's just look at the action of running. All right. What does the knee do when you're running? And that's something that maybe is not very well known. People may think that you're trying to produce force through the knee in order to accelerate yourself through space. That's not what the knee does during running. The force production joints in running are the hip and the ankle,
Yep.
right? So hip extension, plantar flexion, that's what's really pushing you. So what does the knee do? Well, when you're in gait, your initial contact, whether you're a heel striker, ball striker, flat foot, however you land, on initial contact, your center of mass is still moving over your base of support. If your knee was straight, that would be like a pole vault, and you would have to pitch pole over the top of that, which would make movement really, really hard. So the knee flexes in order to allow a smooth transition of the center of mass over the base. But what would happen if the knee didn't stop flexing? Now, keep in mind that when you're running 8 miles an hour, your knee is flexing at like 8,000 degrees per second. What happens if you don't stop that? Your knee would continue to flex and you'd collapse to the ground. So what do the quadriceps do when you're running? They decelerate the knee in order to allow you to continue to move forward. Otherwise, you would fall. They are knee decelerators. So if you're a runner, what's the best type of leg extension to do? Eccentric accentuated.
Yep.
Because those muscles are eccentrically contracting in order to control flexion at the knee during gait.
So up 2, down 1, up 2, down 1 is an
Correct.
example.
A perfect example. So you're not going to change the weight. You can't physically change the weight on the stack once you've got the stack up in the air. So just as you said, you extend with both legs, you lower with one. And that's how you can do an eccentric accentuated leg extension that is going to benefit your running.
Yeah. I think that kind of brings notice that you can do this. You have to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, and understand that eccentrics, you got to work on the chassis. You got to work on that structural part of your body. So, the one muscle action that we still haven't gotten to is isometrics. There's a couple different versions of isometrics. Can you break that down for us?
I'm not sure what you mean by a couple of different versions
Yielding,
of it.
overcoming,
So like make and break?
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, there's what you call make force and break force. So make force is how much force or how much, I mean, it's measured force, right? So typically we use like handheld dynamometers, we apply it to the limb. How much can you push against this object maximally? So that's how much force can you generate against it just pushing maximally. Break is when an outside force is being applied to a limb that you're trying to hold steady. How much force can you take before you give? And so you can your break force is higher than your make force typically. And that sort of gets to the ability of like, how are you resisting versus creating or applying force?
like a wall squat.
Wall squats is, I mean, it's a break force really, but that's not a force magnitude issue. That's a fatigue issue. How long can you sustain that position before you fatigue? Which is another way of looking at it. It's a perfectly suitable way of looking at it.
So now let's kind of put this into a typical advanced elite training tool, contrast training, heavy lifting, plyometric output, plyometric exercise. So something that's going to elicit maximal, typically above 80% of your maximal load. And then you follow it up with a depth jump, let's say, as an example. Or then there's the other version of this, French contrast, which is going to also then incorporate a third movement that's going to do band assisted, let's say, all within a specific period of time, typically. Brutal on the nervous system, but the adaptation has been shown to be extraordinary. Who is this actually appropriate for?
High-level athletes, performance people, or highly trained individuals. It's the only way that I would do it. The complex training was it wasn't really invented, but Donald Chu came up with the concept. He was one of the founders of plyometric training and came up with this notion of complex training, right? You combine strength training with a plyometric activity. I did it a little differently. So what I did was I do strength training, but to fatigue. So what I do is I'll do like a leg press pyramid with a drop set or strip set, and get it all the way down until somebody's wobbly coming off of the thing. And then I'll have them just jump up and down, probably holding dumbbells or something like that. And what that does, so this is a neural, you just said it's tough on the nervous system, and it's tough on the tissues, but it's tough on the nervous system. What you're doing is by fatiguing the system, you're forcing slow twitch motor units to behave like fast twitch motor units. They don't actually generate the same individually. They can't be a fast twitch motor unit. They're slow. But when you put them all together and you have them contracting together, then you get more of a powerful outcome, and that's synchronization. So doing fatigue-based or strip sets or pyramid sets or strength training causes the system to start synchronizing motor unit activity. Then when you have to do something like jumping, where it requires a high rate of force development, very high contractile rates and high rate of force development, all that synchronization that you've just created is now contributing to that jumping motion, and it has a huge training effect. So just as a case study, and I can't mention this individual's name, but back in the 90s, there was a professional basketball player who tore his ACL, and I was working with him to get, in his rehab, for his rehab. And he tore the ACL in his left leg, and before he tore it, he couldn't dunk off his left leg. But we did this kind of training with him. By the way, this is post-ACL reconstruction, rehabilitation. We were doing this training with him. And afterwards, not only had we rehabilitated his knee, but he was dunking off his left leg. So we did this with a bunch of college students, college basketball players, and on average, we increased their vertical jump height by 4 inches. So it works, but it's very, very taxing. I wouldn't do it more than once every maybe once a week or twice a week. This NBA player wanted to do it every time we trained. He was out of his mind, but it worked. So
I find that the high-end athletes are pretty extreme, but they are the equivalent of a pickup truck in some cases, where you can beat the daylights out of it and they're resilient. There's some that are not, that are just fragile. But I think the important or the silver lining through that story is unilateral work versus bilateral work. And that's where I think bilaterals, how does it translate? How does bilateral exercise translate to the universal, to movement? Sprinting isn't done on 2 legs, right? It's a rapid sequence of single-legged horizontal jumps, more or less. That's really where I think unilateral work needs to be a larger part, like if in a training program. You still do bilateral work. I'm not saying not to do it, but I think you should be aware of, if you have a dominant side, and to address those bilateral deficits. I think that's what's really important out of that story that you just shared.
yeah, I think depends on if you have an asymmetry at first, it depends on how big of an asymmetry is it, right? If it's lower body, we typically look at anything beyond 10% as something we should be paying attention to, depending on what we're measuring. Upper body is a little different because we do have side dominance. You don't have side dominance with your legs. You have side dominance with your arms. But the unilateral bilateral thing is interesting because when you do a unilateral squat, right, in order to be able to do it, you have to get your center of gravity over your base. So if you're standing on your left leg, before you can do unilateral squat, your center of mass has to get moved over so it's aligned over your left foot. What does that mean? It means your hip is adducting. And it also means you're going to get a little bit of contralateral pelvic drop. I mean, that's normal. And the problem is you got people in fitness for years who are saying, well, that's a problem. You're not level. Well, you can't be level. If you're moving your center of mass over to the side, you can't be level. But what that also does is it imposes requirements. Now your abductors have to work more. Your abductors and adductors have to work together, right? This antagonistic co-contraction between them in order to manage joint position while you're doing the rest of this movement. You don't get that in a bilateral exercise. So there's an advantage to doing unilateral exercise, especially in the lower body, because of the way it changes the position and dynamics around the hip joint. Remember, you got 3 degrees of freedom in the hip joint. So we have to manage those degrees of freedom. And that's where unilateral exercises are beneficial.
I think, that kind of leads me to biometric training. We always talk about minimizing that ground force reaction time. Um, w- you know, who should be doing biometric training, and or should we be really showing people first the most important thing, learning how to land or step off of a box as an example? Because I see way too many people, I think, starting off with some advanced modalities. I think biometrics are important. They're a great thing for neural drive, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that ultimately everybody can engage in some level of plyometric activity, even if it's something like what I would call a mini jump. A mini jump is just like jumping 2 inches off the floor and back down again in rapid succession. I mean,
Jumping
unless you've got
jacks.
some, and yeah, I mean, it just simple things like that, and then you can progress from there. And then when I progress from there, I reach a point at which we're not just talking about plyometrics; we're talking about now cognitive load and motor control elements, so you can have all kinds of other things flying around, basketballs and balls and whatever you want to do. At some point you get to that. So virtually anybody can start with mini jumps. It's just a question of how far you want to go. Now, in terms of neural drive, plyometrics actually don't involve uh, transcortical neural drive elements. Plyometrics really is just about using stored elastic energy. So you're doing a pre-stretch in the muscle, and that stores elastic energy, which then you use during the concentric phase of the activity in order to increase the force output. That's more of a local type of a thing. That's sort of a monosynaptic reflex pathway that is controlling that. When you want to get into changing neural drive, that's when you need to do more power type training, not plyometric training. It's more explosive training that tells the brain, okay, I've got to recruit motor units a whole different way in order to get this thing going. That's not plyometrics, that's power training.
And I think, kind of leads back to screening and assessment, right?
Sure.
For
Yeah.
longevity purposes, I think I sent you, I don't know if it was this week or the week before, this study that looked at a hand dynamometer and a five squat sit to stand test for the average age group, I think being 85.
Hmm.
And it looked at the time that they took for them to move in these ranges of motion and longitude. And it just showed that the value of this type of training modalities that we're talking about, the decline isn't just in the neural drive, but it's really in them losing the ability in that amortization phase as well. Um, what, you know, should we like, because I feel like the industry is just failing to do baseline testing. One, because they don't know what to do with it. What do I do with a hand dynamometer? The person lifted 55 kilograms, really strong grip, by the way. Um, you know, and then a sit to stand, they did it within 23 seconds. Um, I think the problem is that we set these standards, but don't use them or don't understand how to implement it in a training program.
Well, yeah, whether we are actually doing baseline measures is a really good question at all. And then benchmarks, like how are we benchmarking change over time and what are we measuring? I think in terms of hand grip's been used for ages and ages and ages, and it does correlate well with overall strength and health, interestingly enough. But a correlation just means that there's a relationship between these things. So when you're looking at someone doing a hand grip and you're measuring that force output, all it can do is generally categorize someone's health and well-being. It doesn't tell you what you need to do with them. It just says, look, this person is relatively strong or they're relatively weak. But that's enough for you to look at them and say, okay, well, here are the boundaries of what I can do. Here's the low end, here's the high end. We're going to work somewhere in the middle and get them moving towards the high end. Uh, like an 8-foot get up and go is a whole different thing. And now that's more of a functional test. But you need to understand what are the elements that comprise one's ability to get up and go 8 feet. what are we looking at? And that's where I think we've missed. And that has everything to do with the way trainers are educated in our industry. Trainers would not be able to deconstruct that and really understand what's happening there, right? They just wouldn't be able to break that down. Remember long ago we talked about subroutines and substrates, and if you can't understand what it is that's involved kinematically and kinetically in creating and controlling motion, then you have to ask yourself whether you should be doing it in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that's why people get deterred from testing.
Yeah.
Because they, you know, it's an accountability tool to yourself, to the client, as well as to your programming. So we need to be able to I think that's where technology could help in being able to look at the segmental movement and the forces that they're creating, because then that can identify, hey, during their eccentric action, they are moving at this millisecond of movement compared to their concentric action. And then how do they then change in that change of motion? How do they manage that from a fixed position in a chair like you're talking about? Are they using momentum to get themselves up? Are they able to keep position and create that force? So I think looking at that, but then also looking through that in your exercise regimen, but then tracking something as simple as training volume, you know, uh, for every single working session, is really simple, but no one does it. Everyone goes in and just checks the box of 3 sets of 10, you
This
know,
is true. I mean,
uh,
it's it's very true.
and
Yeah.
I think it's just, I remember the days of having a you know, documenting it on a clipboard and making sure that you're tracking it over a period of time, and you can visibly see your progression. You can visibly see how it relates to body compositioning, their functional movement score, or well, FMS is a whole other conversation. It's
Yeah, don't get
completely
me started.
subjective. I know. I know. I think, for us, I think this conversation really talks about this overview, of a framework of what we need to look at. We need to really ask ourselves, where's this force coming from? Is this really open or closed chain or both? Am I using momentum? Is there any sticking points? I think it's more complex, and I think people need to hold themselves more accountable, trainers, coaches, as well as clients. We're building an engine, and that engine has brakes, has a structure to it that we need to be able to improve. So, really, what I want to leave everyone with is you can choose movement, but I think what you need to do is understand how it affects the biomechanical structure and to be better. So, I think you know, the brain will interpret every position that you hold all day, every day, whatever training stimulus you put through it. It's not going to be able to uh, determine, a 45-pound kettlebell from a 45-pound plate, from a 45-pound pull on a cable, or whatever force you want to create. So it doesn't have eyes. So your architecture is what you like. We started this whole conversation. You engineering a suspension bridge. That's really what we want to do. We want to build it well. So, Dr. Juris, thank you. And I want to wish everyone until next time. If there's a follow-up topic or any questions, leave it in the comment section. Thanks for taking the time to listen.
Thank you, Marcelo. It's a pleasure as always.